Hi everyone, it's Professor Todd here with a tutorial on how to draft a research proposal. In this presentation, I'm going to go over with you the different components or sections to the research proposal, and I'm also going to show you examples of each section. So let's get started. The first section of your research proposal will be the overview and context section. This is where you will provide a general overview of the topic that you've chosen. In the example, for instance, they've chosen the topic of violence, particularly youth violence, and then you will establish the specific issue that you wish to address within that topic. So again, in the example that I've chosen, they're using the topic of violence, but they're looking specifically at the issue of the ways in which conversations about violence are degendered. Then you will provide context for and current events pertaining to this issue. That is, what's happening right now that makes this issue relevant and important today. You will establish the exigency for the issue and show the audience what is at stake. That is, why does this matter? Why is this a timely issue, and why should my audience care about it? And then finally, if you have any key terms or key legislation that needs to be defined or explained for your audience, this is the place that you would do that. Okay, so let's look at an example. When examining societal violence, much of the discussion and analysis seems to focus on issues such as gun control, mental health, gang culture, or frames the issue in ways that often ignore how gender shapes many of these incidents of violence. In fact, discussions about violence in our culture are often degendered, failing to even acknowledge how gender might play a significant role in understanding and addressing violence in our culture. So right off the bat, the person has established the general topic that they're focusing on, which is societal violence, and narrowed it down to a specific issue, which is the way in which discussions about violence are degendered. That is, what they've done here is they've kind of established a missing area from the conversation. That is, when this conversation about societal violence is happening, we talk about gun control, we talk about mental health, we talk about gang culture, we talk about all kinds of stuff, but we don't talk about gender. And so they see that as a missing component of the conversation. That's a great way to approach a topic because a lot of these topics have been discussed extensively before, so you can bring a fresh perspective to it by looking at an area or investigating sort of a missing part of that conversation that's happening around your topic. Even the language used to discuss incidents of violence often relies on gender-neutral terms, with reporters and journalists often referring to shooters or perpetrators or individuals, or characterizing the problem as youth violence or kids killing kids. What such gender-neutral language masks is that nearly all of the incidents of violence and mass killings are done by men and boys. So here's where they're establishing the need for this conversation. In fact, men and boys are responsible for 95% of all violent crimes in this country, and this is an excellent use of sources because you want to remember in this first section I've asked you to use 2 sources. So that's a great way, bringing in some statistics that establish the exigency and show the need for this conversation to happen. The National Academy of Sciences summed up the research in a recent report by saying that male criminal participation in serious crimes at any age greatly exceeds that of females, regardless of source of data, crime type, level of involvement, or measure of participation. So this is just a great use of sources and a great way to introduce the topic and establish the exigency. Now let's look at the current context paragraph. This is especially true when examining incidents of violence like mass shootings such as those at Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Springfield, Columbine, Aurora, or Tucson, to name a few. So here this person has brought in some current events and examples that show how this topic is important and relevant today. It is tempting to look at these shootings as isolated incidents involving deeply disturbed individuals or youth who watched one too many violent video games or who suffered from mental illness. However, such explanations are often short-sighted and fail to truly examine the larger social and cultural forces that contribute to this kind of violence. Imagine if 61 of 62 mass killings were done by women. It is hard to imagine that we would ignore gender in our analysis of violent behavior if this were the case. We would likely be asking questions such as, what is it about women that's contributing to these behaviors? Why are women doing this? And what cultural or social factors are contributing to violent femininity? However, when these incidents are perpetrated by men, we often ignore conversations about gender and instead focus on other potential contributing factors such as alcohol or drug use, mental illness or brain injuries, debates about gun control, or the necessity of stricter gun laws. While none of those factors are inconsequential or should be ignored, our tendency to ignore one of the greatest common denominators seems problematic. Gender is largely absent from much of the national conversation and debate about violence, and this seems to be an area much in need of attention and research. So this has really done an excellent job of providing the context for the argument or the project that's going to take place. When I'm done reading this as a reader, I now understand why this issue is important. They've established the exigency. They've given me some current events and current examples by listing some of the mass shootings that have occurred. They've given me the statistics to show that this is a necessary and important aspect of this conversation. And they've established that this piece is really missing from the current conversation that's happening, that there's not enough attention focused on this area, and that establishes the need for this research project. So overall, this is a really strong example of the overview and context section of the research proposal. Let's look at the next section, the critical conversation section. This is where, now that you've established what your topic and issue are, you will situate it in the conversation that's already happening. So you will show your reader, here's what people are already saying about this issue, so here's where I'm going to fit in. It kind of gives you a way to situate your research project within the conversation or debate that's currently happening. In this critical conversation, I've asked you to establish the ongoing situation, the conversation, present the current debate, and provide at least 3 different perspectives on the issue. The reason for the 3 perspectives is that I'm trying to, or I've asked you to avoid choosing a topic that is either pro, con, for, against, yes, no, because those sort of dichotomous types of research questions and research projects usually ignore the nuance of an argument. So if you were to say, gun control, yes or no, this is, youth violence and mass shootings are a much more nuanced conversation than just saying, gun control, yes or no. While gun control is certainly an important topic, even that topic is more nuanced than just yes or no. So I'm asking you to look for a more compelling and nuanced and complicated aspect of the particular issue that you've chosen, which is why I ask you to present at least 3 different perspectives on that. When you're presenting your 3 perspectives, you should do so with credible authorities. That is, you don't just want to use the first 3 sources that you come across on Google. You want to have 3 credible sources, 3 sort of experts in this field that are presenting the 3 different perspectives that you've chosen. You also want to include signal phrases and transitions, that way that you're incorporating your sources effectively, and you will need to include both synthesis and summary. While the majority of this section will be summary, I do want a little bit of synthesis to show where these perspectives align and also where they diverge. Okay, so let's look at an example. For scholar, filmmaker, and educator Jackson Katz, an examination of violence and mass shootings must involve a discussion about gender. Katz, who is involved in gender violence prevention and has worked extensively with men and boys in sports culture, the military, and in schools, claims in his documentary Tough Guys, what these school shootings reveal is not a crisis in youth culture, but a crisis in masculinity. For Katz and many other gender scholars, it is our cultural understanding of masculinity that's problematic and that works to contribute to societal violence, especially the kind we see evidenced in tragedies such as Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and Columbine. The crisis in masculinity refers to a societal connection between masculinity and violence, being a real man and being a tough guy. He goes on to assert, while the social construction of femininity has been widely examined, the dominant role of masculinity has until recently remained largely invisible. Getting people in mainstream media to talk about white masculinity, which is the central factor in this, as in so many other rampage killings, is difficult because the workings of gender are often invisible in discussions about men. Gender is often seen as a discussion about women or femininity in our culture. So this provides one opinion, and you'll notice in the beginning, the student introduces the author by providing some background on who he is and what his level of expertise is. This both introduces the perspective and also the author and establishes their credibility. And then the student goes on to explain what it is that this person's perspective is, what Jackson Katz believes about this topic. Now let's look at the next perspective. Carlos Anders Gomez, author of Man Up, Cracking the Code of Modern Masculinity, also points to our current definition as manhood as part of the central problem. Here's where that synthesis occurs. Just in that also points to, the student has established the connection between Katz and Gomez, saying that they're both looking at the current definition of manhood as part of the problem. And then in the next sentence, you'll see where they diverge. While he doesn't specifically link manhood and school shootings, Gomez does critically analyze the way masculinity works to limit the emotional and psychological development of young men. Gomez is part of a growing movement of men discussing the alienating emphasis of aggression and dominance in male culture. This movement blames ideas at the heart of male culture for a variety of social ills, from homophobia to bullying to violence against women. Violence is often used to cover up vulnerabilities or as a means of reasserting one's manhood or establishing one's masculinity. So here's where Gomez is summed up. And you see how he's both similar to Katz by talking about manhood as part of the problem, but he differs in that he's not specifically talking about mass shootings. He's really talking about all of the ways in which cultural concepts of masculinity limit men emotionally and psychologically. Now the third perspective. Author, critic, and gender scholar, again, that solid introduction contextualizing the expert. Dr. Michael Kimmel, however, says that gender is only one of the variables that must be examined. Again, here, just by saying that, however, we're showing that Kimmel diverges a little bit from Gomez and Katz, because Kimmel is saying that gender is only one part of the variable. So Kimmel argues the easy availability of guns is another crucial variable, pointing out that in 2011, more than 80% of all homicides among boys 15 to 20 were firearm related. While gender is a large part of the discussion about violence, Kimmel claims that we need a conversation about gun control laws as part of the larger solution. As he explains in a recent article for CNN, more sweeping and necessary is a national meditation on how our ideals of manhood became so entangled with violence and how guns are used as equalizers in establishing manhood. So Kimmel really focuses on the gun violence aspect. So now we have three key perspectives on this issue, each taking somewhat similar approaches, but also offering a unique perspective. And the way that the author has used both synthesis and summary nicely sets that conversation up. All right, so let's look at the next section. This is the section where you will provide your research questions. So you'll give a brief narrative of what the research project hopes to answer and accomplish, and you'll provide your central and primary research question, that is the question that will drive the project. You will also provide any related research question that you hope the project will answer as well. So let's look at an example. This paper will seek to address this absence of gender from our discussion and analysis about violence in our culture. I hope to show how discussing violence in gender-neutral ways not only masks the role gender plays in societal violence, but also prevents us from truly addressing and finding solutions to such violence. Specifically, I hope to research how the media works to socialize men towards violence. I hope to answer the questions: what factors and influences work to normalize male violence in our culture? How are masculinity and violence linked in our culture? In what ways does the media work to encourage violence? Through my research, I hope to specifically answer the question, how does our societal understanding of masculinity contribute to violence and mass shootings? I also hope to explore how socialization and the media play a part in encouraging and normalizing violence for men and young boys. So you see that the first part of this section really gives the narrative of what the project hopes to accomplish. Then we provide some questions that the project hopes to answer, and then the student provides their central research question. That is, this will be the primary question that will drive the project. So you want to make sure to have all those components in this section. The next section is the research plan. This explains how you will begin your research and how you will go about answering the questions that you've posed in the previous section. So you will explain what specific sources and or types of sources you will need to find. You will explain how you'll go about finding those sources, where you will look, where you will begin, and you'll provide specific lists of source needs, key issues, and key search terms. This will be especially helpful in week 6 when we begin working with the library's databases and you start actually doing the research for your annotated bibliography. So let's look at an example. To answer these questions, I need to find research studies and source material that seeks to examine the relationship between pop culture and media, imagery, and masculine identities. I would like to find several different perspectives from gender scholars and masculinity theorists about how our cultural definitions of manhood contribute to violence, aggression, dominance, and lack of empathy in men and boys. I plan to watch Michael Keith's documentary The Bro Code and Jackson Katz's film Tough Guys, as well as research several of the sources these films reference in order to better understand the problem. I would also like to locate several articles that seek to examine and analyze movies, television shows, and pop cultural imagery to show how these medias encourage men and boys to see violence and aggression as desirable, unavoidable, encouraged, and acceptable. I will also need to compile statistical data about societal violence, school shootings, and even sexual violence, and then use scholarly analysis and perspectives to link these trends with cultural messages about masculinity, about manhood and masculinity. The APA might be a starting point for this kind of information. I would also like to find several sources that broadly examine the impact of male violence on our culture and that offer different explanations for this violence. Below is a short list of what I need to gather in my research. So this is a nice overview of the students' research plan, where they begin to, or where they plan to begin by watching some of the documentaries, where they're going to draw the sources from, and where they're going to look for these sources, what types of sources they need, etc. Then we will get to the lists. The source needs, first a list of the kind of statistical data, commentary and analysis, opinion-based articles, expert analysis and scholarly opinions, gender theory, feminist criticism, and studies or analysis on masculinity. So they give a detailed list of the source needs, the needs that they will have to meet when gathering sources for their annotated bibliography. Then the key issues that they're going to investigate, along with the search terms that they're going to use. These search terms are going to be particularly helpful to you again in week 6 when you begin working in the library's databases. To already have this list prepared will save you a lot of time, because when you go into those databases, you'll just start plugging these terms in to help you find the articles that you need. And then the very last section of the annotated bibliography, of the research proposal is just a bibliography of the sources. Remember, you must include at least 5 total sources. You have to have at least 2 sources in the first section, the overview and context section, and then you have to have at least 3 sources in the second section, which is that critical conversation presenting the 3 different perspectives. So you will need MLA citations and a bibliography at the end of your research proposal for those sources and any other sources that you might have used or consulted when crafting your research proposal. And here's just an example of what that looks like for the one that we just looked at, this sample that we just went through. Okay, so these are all of the components to your research proposal, and the sample that I've used in this presentation is also the sample that's available to you on Canvas if you want to go back and have a look at it there. Okay, thanks so much.